So hello, good afternoon. And as Louise said, my name is Jim O Donoghue, and it's very nice to be here to talk to you today. So I have worked in designing patient services and patient technologies, I guess, for the last about 15 years. And as part of that, I kind of made it my business to go into patients' homes and to see how they were experiencing these services, and also see how they were using technology. I also have set in clinical call centres and listened in a little bit on calls between nurses and the patients that they were talking to, just to hear the nature of the conversations, which, by the way, tend to be really rich and personal and close. And I've also spent a lot of time in rooms with pharma companies and med tech companies and clinicians and patients, trying to co-create services that would really make sense and have an impact on patients' lives. So that's what I've tried to do. I'm a technologist by background, so really I'm going to talk about the future of patient services, and in particular how technology is going to impact that future over the next few years. And as much as possible, I'm going to base it on the experience that I've had and that we've had as a company in terms of designing these services across a range of conditions. So first big question, why are we here, and what's really the role of pharma in terms of providing these services? And I know from some of the keynotes earlier today that there's a lot of talk in the industry about really what is the role. Should I be developing services that really are supporting my therapy, or should I be developing services that are broader than that? And pharma's, I think, struggling with that and trying to understand really what patients want and what clinicians kind of expect and what services they'll use, and also, what the regulator's going to think about the services that are provided. So there is this questioning that's going on. And there's kind of three questions for those of you who are involved in patient services. There's three questions I'd like you to maybe think about as we go through the presentation. So first one, if you have a patient service, what's its real core function? Is it designed to support access and delivery to your therapy specifically? Or is it a broader strategic thing? Is it a key part of value-based care? And do you see it really as influencing patient outcomes and being part of the value proposition that you're bringing? So I think that's a key question. Second question is, when you design a patient service, are you thinking about it as a kind of a silo, one more healthcare silo, where the interactions within that patient service and the data that's gathered as part of that patient service kind of remain in the patient service and maybe never make it to the clinician and the care team? Or are you thinking about it as an integrated part of patient care and really fundamental to the way care is delivered? And the third and final question to remember, and I'm going to answer these questions hopefully at the end of the presentation, are, traditionally a lot of these patient support services have been designed to support specialty conditions. And they were probably set up 20 years ago, and they really focus on those conditions, and that's probably still broadly true today, I would say. But if you could ideally decide which conditions they would be for, would you really have them for all conditions that you provide therapies for? So there are the three questions I'd like you to keep in mind as we go through, and you can let me know at the end whether I make an attempt at answering them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience about the services we've designed in the past and been involved in. I'm going to talk a little bit about when I look at the services we're designing now and what we're seeing in terms of interaction with clients, what those services look like. And then I'm going to talk about, what's further down the line and what's kind of the next stage of patient services. So that's the journey that we're going to go on. So first of all, today's patient services, the majority of patient services today are focused, I would say, on access, ensuring that patients can financially access the therapies, maybe giving some reimbursement advice, providing some medication support, and maybe providing some level of education and coaching and logistic support. And largely those services are delivered by nurses in call centres, or nurses that go and visit patients in their home. And sometimes they're supported by a level of, I would say, what I'd call low-tech digital. So they're supported by maybe some websites, maybe some basic mobile applications. And those services are good. And as I said, I've sat in those clinical call centers and listened to the interactions between clinicians and patients find them really useful. But they tend to be very planned services. They tend to be services where there's an interaction between the nurse and the patient, which maybe is following a very planned pattern. And no matter who the patient is, it kind of follows the same pattern. They get a call maybe on day 3, they get a call on day 12 to see how they're doing with their injections. They maybe get a call on day 26. And there's a very standard design of service for patients and a very standard set of interactions that they get. And the other issue with them is these services tend to be reasonably expensive to provide, and they tend to be not that scalable if you have to try and replicate that across a lot of different countries. And as a result, some of these services tend to be available in some of the bigger countries and maybe not available in some of the smaller countries. So there's a second set of things going on, I would say, which is separate to those patient services. And that's, a thing that's been referred to already about how patients are typically interacting now in this digital connected world, how they're interacting with their treatment and with their condition. And typically patients will go online, obviously, when they get some symptoms, and they'll research and they'll try to figure out for themselves what their condition might be. And maybe then they will, when they get an initial diagnosis, they'll be thinking, okay, what's the right treatment for me? And somebody earlier today, one of the keynotes referenced the fact that for RA patients, there was a study done, and 50% of RA patients, when they're sitting in the doctor's surgery, they're researching possible treatments for them. So patients are using the tools that they use really as consumers. They're accessing the internet, they're looking at information that's available online. And then they might move on and they might join some online communities. They might share some information, look to get some support from people who are going through the same type of thing. And maybe even they might download some healthcare applications. So there's a separate journey, separate to the patient support service provided by Pharma, but it's part of the patient's world, I would say. And then there's a third thing that's going on today, and that's that digital patient technologies, I would say, are really exploding, is the only word that you can use for it. And what we're seeing, and we're involved in a lot of this activity, we're seeing a huge amount of connected patient applications, maybe to support patients around adherence. We're seeing a lot of connected devices, a lot of wearable sensors, connected inhalers and drug delivery devices like auto-injectors. And these technologies are being created almost separate to the patient support services. And companies, pharma companies, medtech companies are learning about how to, introduce these to patients and what to do with the data that's gathered from them. But often, again, it remains a little bit of a silo. So if I was to summarize, I think today where we are is there's different forms of patient engagement going on, but they're quite different, they're quite separate, and they're not really joined and integrated together. I think part of the future that I'm going to talk about is when these types of technologies and when these types of services can really be joined together to create the best patient experience and the best patient outcomes. Okay, so if that's now, I'm now going to talk about what's near. And for me, near means services that we're involved in designing today that may take a year or two before they become released to patients and delivered to patients, or conversations that we're having now. But these are topics that I think are really becoming rich and important. So the first thing that's going to happen, and it is happening, is that traditional PSPs, these nurse-delivered services, are going to be made more efficient and enhanced by digital services in the same way as digital technology really makes more efficient every sector that it touches. And a way that we think about this when we're sitting and designing these services is we think about what's the difference between a human-delivered service and a technology-delivered service. And there's a number of different characteristics, I would say, and this is just one way of looking at it. So the interaction frequency with a digital service is going to be different to what's generally going to be possible with a human service. Just practically, that's going to be the case. You'd also expect that a digital service, if it's designed correctly, is much more responsive because, in a sense, if it's delivered via smartphone, the responsiveness is going to be immediate and it's going to be in the patient's hand. The cost should be a bit lower per interaction. And the data that you can gather from these types of services is going to be, by definition, it's going to be richer because you're going to gather data about every interaction that happens. So you know the types of education that a patient is interested in. You know how frequently they're interacting with the service. And there's a few other characteristics like accessibility, like scalability. Intimacy is an interesting one, you know, how personal that interaction feels to the patient, and reach, you know, how many countries can this be deployed to, and can you what percentage of the population can you reach using these services? And just to bring it to life a little bit, one of the key things that we found is that when you're designing these services, you really have to take into account, obviously, the condition, the patient cohort, and the goals of the service. And if I take asthma, for example, if you were sitting down and you were deciding what kind of a service would be good to provide to my asthma patients, you might look at this set of characteristics and you might say, well, actually, okay, so most asthma patients, they have a condition, they take a treatment on a regular basis, they may have occasional episodes, but by and large, they're getting on with their life. And they're not looking for probably a lot of human interaction. They're not looking for nurses to call them and ask them how they're doing. But they are interested in support. They are interested in knowing, for example, are they using their inhaler correctly? They are interested in being reminded that, yeah, actually, now is a good time to take your inhaler. So they're interested in frequent, light interaction. And if we look, for example, I guess if you're a pharma company and you're thinking about designing one of these services, you're also thinking, well, there's a very large population out there spread over, you know, all the countries of the world. So I'm going to need to design something that's very scalable. So I might say, if I was picking out a few things here, I might say, okay, the cost of interaction probably needs to be quite low. I'm going to be able to gather quite a lot of data because there's going to be a lot of interaction on a daily basis, typically a daily medication. And, but the intimacy level may be quite low, actually, because that's not really what patients want. On the other hand, if I'm designing a multiple sclerosis patient, it's a more complex disease. It requires a huge amount of more diagnostics, tests, and interaction with specialists. And the type of support I want, I don't necessarily need that immediacy of response because maybe, you know, my therapy might be something I'm taking a few times a week, or it might be less frequent than that. And I may not want to be reminded all the time either, but what I would like is that there's a lot of data gathered about how I'm doing, about my quality of life. And I would like that when I go see my neurologist, that data is available to them. And I might want my neurologist to be able to see whether, if I was recently admitted to hospital, what was the cause for that admission. I might want my neurologist to see if I was having issues around brain fog, if I was having spasticity issues. I might be interested in them having a rich picture as to what my daily life was. But I probably wouldn't want a huge amount of interaction. So the service would need to be designed accordingly. And again, if I was to look to another disease, maybe like multiple myeloma, in that case, what I may really want is actually I might want that I can access my care team, not a patient support service, but I can access my care team when I'm having difficult symptoms or when I'm having difficult side effects with my condition. So what I might really want there is quick access to my care team and be able to schedule, for example, a video consultation if that's what I needed. And there's been lots of studies that show that when cancer patients are supported, that they do much better. So we've looked at how you might vary the kind of human-digital mix across a service that you design. And I mentioned at the start this question about, well, you know, who are these services for? Are they really only for patients with specialty conditions? And I would say there is an opportunity with specialty conditions, but the opportunity is probably not to replace human services, but to make them more efficient by designing integrated technical and patient services. On the other hand, if I have a condition like asthma, and it's a primary condition, and it's treated by GPs by and large, then actually what I might want is a light touch digital only service. And on the other hand, if I've got a rare condition, what I really want is good access to my care team to be able to have a discussion, because really it's quite a unique condition, and whoever I'm talking to, I want them to really understand my history. So I think patient services are going to expand to much more conditions now that technology is able to do that, but the nature of those services is going to be different depending on the type of condition that it is. Now, I've already mentioned connected devices, and these are becoming more prevalent, and they're a key part of the jigsaw, because it's great to be able to remind patients around their medication. It's great to be able to gather feedback from patients about how they're doing on a daily basis. But it's also good to have some hard data around whether patients have actually taken their injection. It's also good to be able to have continuous measurements from a wearable sensor that give you a good insight into someone's condition. It could even be that, that it's really, really useful to have implanted devices that monitor, for example, heart failure, as an example, where they give you a really good indication as to whether somebody's going down a route where they may have some trouble. So mixing the soft data that you can gather through the interactions with patients with this hard data from an increasing number of connected devices is a key part of the puzzle, and that's going to happen. And although some of those devices exist at the moment, the data from them doesn't really feed into patient support programs. And I think the key is going to be making that data available to patient support programs so they can make data-driven interventions with patients. And another key thing that we see over and over again, particularly over the last 1 to 2 years, as I think this topic has got a lot more prevalence and understanding, even from the things that we know about what's happening in the more general environment. We know that Facebook is really good at understanding and nudging us in a certain direction. We know that Netflix is really good at getting us to watch the next movie. We know Amazon is good at recommending the next book. So at a kind of global consciousness level, we are starting to understand that there's ways in which people make decisions. But what hasn't happened yet is that hasn't been applied in a real good way to healthcare. And it certainly hasn't been deployed at scale using digital technology. So we talked about the idea that patients will share data from their connected devices, so biometric data, adherence data. If services are designed right, patients will also share data about how they're feeling, so their patient-reported outcomes, their self-reported outcomes, how they're feeling on a daily basis, their quality of life measures. And we know through wearable devices, perhaps we can gather symptom recording. So we have a lot of information about what's going on with a patient. But the last piece to add to that is to kind of try and understand what their emotional journey is. What are the issues that they're having? What are their beliefs about their medication? And if we can take that information about understanding patients, the journey that they're going through, how they're making decisions, whether they're making bad short-term decisions just because they haven't really been able to embed a habit a healthy habit into what they're doing. If we can understand what the challenges that they have from a behavioral perspective, then when we make these and use these digital technologies and make these interventions, we can do that on the basis of trying to influence a behavior. And that can be a lot more successful than just sending them information for information's sake. So I think there's a huge opportunity around behavioral change, behavioral model, behavioral science, to incorporate that and deliver that at scale as part of patient services. So all of those things, I would say, are things that we're designing services around today with our customers. And so they're the here and now, I would say, and those types of services are going to be launched over the next 1 to 2 years. If we look a little bit further down the path, I would say, and just take maybe a step back and look at the bigger picture, and it's been referred to a few times already in this conference by some of the keynote speakers, this movement towards value-based care. Now, you can make the argument, and it would probably be a fair argument, that pharma has been relatively slow in that move so far. But you can also say that actually there's a lot of things happening. Now, apologies for that reference because that's been used at least 2 or 3 times in the presentations I've seen already. But it's an interesting one because what it shows is that there's cross-industry partnerships happening with new entrants into the market, and they're thinking around population health and looking at holistically preventative care using technology in the best possible way to manage patients. A bit closer to home, then we also see Roche acquiring Flatiron, and that's so that they can get a deeper, better understanding of their patients and patient groups, and they can use that information to define and design better patient services and patient therapies. And then we see companies like Apple also entering the space, focusing initially on building patient services and population health services for their own employees, but for sure with the intention that they're going to roll that out beyond their employees once they're just piloting it on their employees. And finally, if you look at the medtech sector, companies like Medtronic are making a huge effort and a huge move towards value-based care. So they're partnering with healthcare provider organizations across a range of conditions, and they're not specific to the products that they provide. They're around a range of conditions and areas that they're interested in. And they're partnering with healthcare providers to use big data, analytics, connected devices, all of the things that we've been talking about to improve patient care and to do it in a proactive and preventative way. So this move towards value-based care is a thing that's happening whether we as pharma like it or not. And the second kind of big thing I would say is this, and again, data has been talked about a lot in the conference so far, but this move towards predictive and preventative care. And again, just to think about practically what that might mean. So we talked about patient data being gathered, data from connected devices, data that patients provide as part of interactions with services. Now, if you combine that with clinical data and you combine that with population level data, then you can do some powerful things. And again, we've seen already, and there's some good pilot studies done around things like predicting hypoglycemic events. You know, companies like Medtronic working with IBM Watson have created initial pilots that show that they can predict those kinds of events. There's a lot of work going on in the area of COPD exacerbation prediction. Again, what are the triggers? What are the vital signs? What is the information that we can look at to help us predict when people are going to have those exacerbations? And equally in seizures for epileptic patients. That's a huge area of research and activity at the moment. And if we could predict those things, and if we could make those predictions actionable so that we could give that early insight to patients, and then we can provide them with advice that will help them make the right decisions that might either alleviate, postpone, or prevent those kinds of episodes. I mean, how powerful would those services be? Whoever is providing them, whether it's pharma or medtech or healthcare providers, how powerful would that be? And if you talk about sticky services, if you could do those things as part of your service, for sure they'd be sticky services for patients. So what does the future look like? So people talk about patient centricity a lot, but it can be a little bit difficult to get a grasp of. For me, patient centricity involves personalized care. So we looked at the start at traditional patient support services that are delivered by nurses tend to be, just by the limitations that delivery mechanism has, they tend to be very planned interventions. And they tend to be a little bit same kind of intervention for everybody. Now with technology, we can really personalize those. And the more we understand about patients, the more data we have, the more we can personalize them. And the reason we're personalizing them is not for fun. It's because if something is relevant to you and it's an intervention that really speaks to you, then it'll be much more impactful. With digital technology, we also have the possibility to make service and support more continuous. And if you can integrate that with the best of human-delivered services, then that becomes, again, really powerful. We want the interactions and the support we provide to patients to be data-driven. You know, we've all interacted with great nurses and great patients, and that's a great feeling when you do, but that's not very scalable. So can we make the interactions data-driven and of very high quality all the time? We talked about behavioral, so ultimately, helping people to live healthier lives and helping people to manage their condition in a better way is all about influencing patient behavior. And if we can incorporate that into our patient services, that's really powerful. Predictive tools, still a little bit of ways off, but if we can build them into our services, then you're adding real value and you're impacting patient outcomes. And then finally, integrated. So, we don't want to have these silos of services. We want to have patient services where the data is shared and it's part of the way patients are looked after. So it's not just a separate silo that's provided by an entity. So I asked 3 questions at the start, and I hope I've convinced you a little bit at least. So I think that patient services can be an absolute key part of delivering value-based care for patients. And I think that really good patient services are going to be an integral part of patient care. They're not going to be something that's just provided as an optional extra that some patients use and some patients don't. We want a situation where clinicians are really referring and wanting their patients to be on that service because the information they're going to get from that is going to be really valuable. And we want to expand these services beyond specialty conditions to primary conditions and to rare conditions, because there's no reason with digital technology that they can't be across all of that range and spectrum of conditions. So with that, I'm going to finish. Just a quick advertisement. We do have a workshop tomorrow which is around behavioral change. If you haven't signed up for it and you're interested in that topic, please do. But apart from that, that's it.